These key ingredients of a business process are illustrated in the figure which is shown here. Let's first unpack each of the ingredients and then discuss how they all come together. So firstly, events. Events represent things that can happen instantaneously. We say that events happen atomically, essentially causing a change in any state. Now, events don't have a duration. So for example, an event such as an invoice has been received just happens all on its own, and although we can say the invoice is received, say in the morning for example, we don't measure how long it is received for. Events typically trigger the execution of some activity. For example, take a dark room with nobody inside. As soon as you walk into the room, that action represents an event. It causes a change in the state of that room, which is empty and dark, and it triggers an activity of, say, switching on the light and an activity of walking to the other end of the room. In our Build It case study, an example of an event is the arrival of equipment at a construction site. Later on, you will see that events typically denote a start of a process or an end of a process, or some intermediate stage of that process. Secondly, activities. In essence, activities are the planned things that happen which can be measured over a period of time. In other words, they have a duration. For instance, in our example of entering a dark room, the activity of walking from one side of the room to the other side of the room is an activity which can be measured. Say, it takes you 5 seconds to walk from one end of the room to the other. Another example of an activity is presented in our Build It case study, for instance, when the site engineer inspects the equipment upon arrival. This is an activity because it can be measured over a period of time or has a duration. Say it takes the site engineer, for example, 20 minutes to inspect the equipment which has arrived. Because of this, we say that events are units of work that have a specific or particular duration. Third, tasks. Now, you don't see this on the diagram, but tasks are encapsulated within an activity. And you can think about these as those things that make up the units of work which make up an activity. Therefore, tasks represent an activity that is very simple and small enough that it can be seen as a singular unit of work. We say, for example, that a task is finite or a fine-grained unit of work. For example, you could step into a room and simply stand still. That task of standing you could assume to be a very small amount of work that you are doing. In our case study, if the inspection of the equipment is simply a quick checkbox to see that the equipment has indeed arrived and that you're not doing any detailed verification or checking of the equipment, that specific activity can then be thought of as a task. Fourth, decision points. Another ingredient to a process are the decision points. These are the points in time when a decision is made which in turn influences or affects the way a process will flow or be executed. So for instance, upon investigating the equipment, the site engineer needs to make a decision such as that the equipment is acceptable or perhaps not acceptable. In either case, different things need to be done based on that specific decision. Now, at this point, you can see on the diagram that a business process consists of or is made up of events, a series of one or more activities, and a combination of decision points. The fifth ingredient is actors. Actors represent anyone or anything that makes or takes part or is involved in the process. For example, either they do something or they contribute to that process. This is made up of human actors such as, say, the site engineer, the clerk, the works engineer, and so on, as well as organizations and software systems that can act on behalf of those human actors. Secondly, actors can either be internal or external to the process. Internal actors, also known as process participants, are those actors who operate within the organization where the process is being executed, while external actors, on the other hand, operate outside of the organization where the process is being executed. We can logically deduce that actors such as the clerk and the site engineers are internal actors or process participants, while the equipment suppliers, for example, can be regarded as external actors. Another important actor that is involved in a process is an actor called the customer. Now, the customer can be thought of as the actor who consumes the final product of the process. This is certainly the site engineer, right? Because he or she is the customer, because this whole process is put in place to ensure that they have the correct equipment on site to enable them to do their job. If the site engineer receives the correct equipment and he or she is happy and that they can do their job, later on we refer to this as the positive outcome of the process. If they are, say, unhappy as a result of the equipment that is not satisfactory or is delayed, we can think about this as the negative outcome for the customer. It is important to note that customers can be both internal or external to an organization. The sixth ingredient is objects. A process can involve various objects, which are the physical, tangible things that you can touch and see, such as the equipment, the materials, and the various documents that get generated throughout the process. Now, we differentiate between physical objects, such as those that you can see, like the equipment and the materials and so on, as well as informational objects, which are typically documents and records that can be stored electronically. Say, for example, the electronic invoice. Again, looking at the diagram, we can see that a business process involves a number of actors and objects. The seventh ingredient is outcomes. When a process is being executed, what results from this is known as the outcomes of that process. Think about this as the value that is created for the organization by implementing the process in the very first place. An example of this in our case study is that the rental process leads to a piece of equipment being used by Build It and a payment being made to enable the site engineer to fulfill their task. So, a business process then delivers an outcome. And outcomes from a process, as we've seen before, can either be positive or negative outcomes. Positive outcomes are those outcomes that give value to the customer, who is in essence an actor. Now, all these different ingredients are depicted in the diagram which is shown here. I urge you to read through the university admission process and see if you can identify all of these different key ingredients. Now that you have a good enough understanding of all the key ingredients that make up a process, we are now ready to provide a formal definition of a process. We can define a business process as a collection of interrelated events, activities, and decision points that involve a number of actors and objects, which collectively lead to an outcome that is of value to at least one customer. Since we defined each of these key terms in the definition, it should help make better sense of what a business process then is. All right, now that we are armed or equipped with the knowledge of what a business process is, we can go a step further and define what we mean by the term business process management, or BPM.